Hey, you'll have to forgive me for my voice, I'm a little sick. Also, I'm a bit lazy with my Polish these days, so I'm going to do this in English. So in response to your Gen Y video, first and foremost I find the generalizations on the generations very, very frustrating, although I can see why people would do that. It sort of does make some sense to discuss sort of how kids were brought up and how parenting styles were different. I would say that perhaps you and I were brought up, well, I can't speak for you, but my parents were certainly more on the authoritarian side of things. Although a lot of my friends growing up in Australia, they were more on that dialogue side of things, and my parents did try and adapt, and I commend them for that, because that's not easy to do when you come from such a different culture. So you have this idea of, you have a generation that's used to just listening to orders, you have a generation that's going to question the orders, but I think this is a little short-sighted because, the Gen Xers, or the baby boomers, or whoever you want to talk about, like, they were starting revolutions and they were doing wild things when they were young. It's just when they got older and what they got used to was perhaps more along the lines of, okay, I'm just going to listen, like, I've spent my youth fighting and I'm lazy now, or this is the easier way out. And so as each younger generation comes along, they have their own fight, right? So the baby boomers had this kind of fight for sexuality, fight for, I guess, freedom, fight against whatever wars were going on, and some of these gender stereotypes that go on. While then the next generation sort of was, I guess, the baby boomers and the Gen X are not the same generation. So let's talk about Gen X then, being that generation post the baby boomers that kind of enjoyed all the fruits of their labor, sort of enjoyed the feminism, maybe created some second, third waves. Forgive me if I'm completely wrong on this, because I don't know a lot about this, and now I've started to digress. But my main point was just that as the generations age, they behave in a different way. So I always find these generalizations quite frustrating. And I get them thrown in my face quite a bit, oh, you're Gen Y, so then this. You're Gen Y, so then that. No, I don't think so. Like, you can't... I mean, it's as shitty as horoscopes, right? You can't just group a whole bunch of people and give them a bunch of statements and saying that's what they're like. I just don't buy it, that's all. But it's an interesting idea, and it's one to explore, and I think it's more to do with youth rather than necessarily... the generation. But still, there's always something to talk about there. Now, the main reason I'm making the actual video, though, was because I wanted to put a quote from Socrates, which I thought was hilarious, talking about youth and how they don't respect the elders and crap. And I don't know if it's true or not, but I just thought it was quite funny, because this problem has always existed. But there's a blogger, her name is Penelope Trunk, and she has Asperger's, I can never pronounce that word. And she runs a website, penelopetrunk.com, easy stuff. And she has kids now, she's in her 30s. And her kids, I guess, are Generation Z. And she writes about them. And I think it's quite interesting what she writes. I'm just going to read behind. So, I mean, she's based in the US, and so she's writing from that kind of American perspective, which is not necessarily actually what's going on in Australia or in Poland. I mean, these countries are at very different stages. But, again, another flaw in this whole, generational idea, because... what's a generation across what countries? Like, would a Gen X in Poland be equivalent to a Gen X in the US? Would that be equivalent to a Gen X in Canada or Australia or in Brazil? I mean, these countries are at such different stages. Who's to say that the parenting is necessarily along the same lines? And I mean, I've digressed now, but I'm going to go down this tangent. So if you have these... catch my tangent. Yeah, so there are styles of parenting that work, I think, depending on where the country is at the moment. Because if you were to try to do, and I know this is along the lines of that, authoritarianism only works in China bullshit because they need it because it's young economy. And I don't want to go down that road too far. But I think that the reason some of these styles can work is because there are jobs, country's relatively safe. The most exciting thing that's going to happen to a teenager might be their first kiss or something. I was going to say blowjob, let's say kiss. And so along those lines, you can have different styles of parenting depending on where your country is. and how your country's doing. I mean, not to discount the fact that dialogue wouldn't be great in all countries, but there are some cases where, okay, you know, kid lives in a favela in Rio, and they want to have an open dialogue on why they can't go outside at night time, and it's sort of like, well, you know what, if you're going to push this and we're going to risk this, then you're going to die, and I just can't, like, I can't even really discuss this with you. So I don't know, maybe that's just my authoritarian background coming through. Wow, this has gone on many tangents. Point is, A, generalizing by generations doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, because the youth has their own fight within that generation, and then as they age, they change sometimes. A lot of people change. 2, generations X, Y, Z across different countries probably aren't the same, because different things happening in different countries, so it's not necessarily comparable, so it's silly to talk about this anyway. And point number 3, I guess going back to what I was going to say before about the Generation Z, I think what Penelope Trunk writes about is pretty interesting. I'm going to put a link to it. And yeah, I like her articles because I read them and they annoy me, and I don't agree with her at all. And then I think about it, and then I'm like, oh, you know what, she kind of has some points. And she goes out and just writes some really blatant things. Like, she sort of wrote out a blueprint for a woman's life, and she's writing that women should have kids when they're 25, because if you want to have a high-powered career, they need to be out of the house by the time you're 45, so you're still young enough to start something. And things like this, and some of the stuff she writes, it's just like, or the very pro Marissa Meyer, pro anti-telecommuting, that sounds funny, doesn't it? This idea that, you know what, if you have any kind of difficult career, suck it up, you can't do it from home, you can't work part-time. And yeah, some of these things I don't agree with them, I don't like them, but that doesn't mean they're wrong. And the more I think about them, the more I'm like, I don't have any great arguments against this. So, that was all. And this is